So I am Katie Wolfert. I am a Ph.D. candidate in the Rutgers Infancy Studies Lab, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how babies are like scientists. So they actively explore their world using their senses, and that helps them to learn language. So we are the Rutgers Infancy Studies Lab located on the Newark campus. And in the middle here, hopefully you can see my mouse. This is Dr. April Benesic. She's the director of our lab. And as a lab, we're really interested in sensory processing, especially hearing and auditory processing, and how that helps babies to learn language from about 4 months old to about 18 months old. So here in the lab, we think that babies have amazing brains, and I'm sure that all of you who have babies would agree with me. So looking at this graph here, we can see part of the reason that babies are such amazing learners and they can really use their brains to the fullest extent. So looking at the blue line, the brain in infancy has a very strong ability to change in response to experience. So babies are soaking up everything that's around them in their environments, and they can learn and grow from that in response to that. And then over time, as we get older, that ability goes down a little bit, but it never goes to zero. So we are always able to learn throughout our life. The catch is that, looking at the orange line, it takes more effort as we get older to make changes. So for babies, it's relatively easy for them to learn from their environment and change in response to experience. And that's what makes them such great learners. So not only do babies kind of passively soak up what's happening in their environment, but they're also active learners. So they form expectations about what is happening in the world, and they kind of make predictions, and they almost run like mini experiments in the same way that scientists do. So a baby, just as an example, who is learning about gravity might observe something that happens in their environment. So they might see like an object falling off the table. So that's their observation. And then after they observe that, they create a prediction or an expectation about the way the world works. So they might expect that, every time something falls from a height, it's going to fall to the ground. And then they're going to start running some mini experiments to gather some new information and test their prediction. So that often looks like hitting objects off the table over and over again. And if their experiments confirm what they thought previously, they might just repeat that experiment a couple times to make sure. If the result does not meet what their expectation was, they're going to have to update their expectations and create some new predictions about the way that they think that the world works. So then they're going to repeat the process of gathering new information, running more experiments over and over again. And that's one of the ways that they learn, just in the same way that scientists gather new information about the way that the world works. So throughout this talk, I'm going to try to highlight some tips for you about ways that you can support this active learning process, and that you can help your baby's brain development based on what researchers have found about the way that babies learn. So we're going to focus really specifically on learning language here, because that's what we're really interested in as a lab, and that's what I find really interesting too, and hopefully you guys do as well. So we know that babies are very good at learning language. They are excellent language learners. They're taking in all sorts of clues from their environment around them. So a baby probably has their caregivers, their siblings, their parents talking around them, often talking to other adults. They might be talking to the baby. So that's kind of auditory sound input. They also might get some visual input, so they're watching your mouth move as you talk. They might also be watching you read a book to them, for example, so that's an audio-visual connection there. And they have to use their senses to take in all this information, auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and they piece all that together to learn language and kind of to start to figure out language and how to understand and also produce language themselves. So they're really reliant on their senses to do this, and we're going to focus in on the auditory sense because we're really interested in that in the lab, but of course the other senses are also very important as well. So we're going to go way back to the beginning to talk about when hearing first starts to develop. So sounds definitely do travel through the body into the womb. So babies have the opportunity to start hearing long before they're born. So we first, as researchers, observed that babies kick in response to sounds reliably around 27 weeks. And not only are they able to hear sounds, but we also researchers have shown evidence of auditory learning also in the womb. So babies will become familiar to their mother's voice, of course, because that's what they're exposed to very frequently. And then researchers have also found that if a mother reads a story frequently during pregnancy out loud, like Cat in the Hat, the baby, right after they're born, they'll have a preference for that story that was read very often. Same thing with songs. If you play a song very often, the baby might be born with a preference for that song. So that's really cool that we can see not only are babies hearing, but they're also starting that learning process as well. So that's our first tip, is that reading, singing, talking to your baby during pregnancy is all great. They are definitely listening and they are paying attention and learning from that input. It's also an opportunity to expose babies to your favorite songs if you want them to be kind of aligned with your song preferences as well. So after birth, the brain continues to grow, and it starts to grow in ways that support the sharpening of their hearing and other senses. So the first big change that happens is that connections start to be built between neurons, which are cells in the brain. So this is a graph from a scientific paper, and it's showing the number of connections that are built between neurons. So we're just going to focus in on what the really important parts are of that picture. So we're showing the total number of synapses or connections between neurons and how that changes over time as throughout the whole lifespan, actually. So you can see that from birth, it starts to go up and it peaks around 6 to 12 months, and then it goes down a little bit as the connections are refined. And then finally it starts to plateau around 10 years and then throughout the rest of the lifespan. So this is just an example from the brain's main visual area, but this happens all over the brain in other areas as well. So babies are building those strong connections in the first year of life. And then another change that happens is that the neurons, the brain cells, actually get an upgrade that helps them to send information at a faster rate. So that could be information between two brain cells. It could also be information like from the ears to other areas of the brain, or the eyes to the brain. So they can send information at a faster rate, and that helps them to be more efficient when they're processing or responding to things in the environment. And then finally, another change that happens is that the brain becomes more organized. So things that are pieces of information that are similar tend to be processed in similar areas of the brain. So two sounds that are very similar to each other might be processed in two neurons that are close to each other, for example. So all of these changes contribute to the efficiency of a baby's brain. And we can see that as these changes are happening, that helps them to be better at hearing. So I'm going to highlight some parts of some aspects of hearing that are especially important for language here. So in the first year of life, babies improve at pitch perception, so high versus low sounds, localization, so where in the world the sound is coming from, separating out background noise. So if a baby's in a noisy room, how do they start to focus in on just the person who's talking to them and ignore everything else? Tracking fast changes, so the ability to track really fast changes in sounds, and perceiving sounds in their native language. And those last 2 points we're going to talk about in more detail because those are things that our lab especially looks at. So speech sounds, that aspect of language, is essentially really fast changes in that our voice makes in sound. So this is a diagram that sort of represents what a sentence looks like in terms of the sound qualities. So you can see that it goes up and it goes down, and all these changes happen very quickly in the time course of like milliseconds. And if you're just looking at this, it all kind of blends together. Like it's a really big challenge for a baby to start to separate out what all these different sounds mean and what concepts or objects in the world they actually connect to. So they have to use their hearing skills to start to separate all these things out. And one of the skills that I want to highlight, the first one, is tracking fast changes in sound. So the way that we measure this in our lab is we use EEG, or electroencephalography, which is a way to measure brain activity. So we have these little sensor nets that babies wear. They're specially sized for babies, and they have little soft sponges on them that pick up on electrical activity in the brain. So babies wear these caps while they're just sitting on their parents' lap, and then we play sounds for them, and we look at how the baby's brain responds to these sounds. So what we found in the lab is that babies' brain activity at 6 months, when they're listening to sounds that contain very fast changes in them, actually predicts their language skills later on, even at 3 years of age. So this demonstrates that these rapid auditory processing skills are very important, and they're laying that foundation for language learning later on. So something that I wanted to highlight related to this ability to listen to fast changes is something that parents often do instinctually, which is infant-directed speech. So you might know this as like baby talk or motherese or parentese. So this is, it refers to the difference in the way that adults tend to talk to babies versus talking to adults. So this graph kind of depicts that difference. So if I was talking to an adult, I would say, "Where's the dog?" You know, just talking normally. In contrast, if I was talking to a baby, I might say, "Where's the doggy? Where is he?" You know, so I'm using a baby voice to talk to them. And this graph shows how that goes from kind of low pitches to high pitches. So there's kind of that exaggerated pitch, whereas for an adult, it's a little bit flat. It also shows how there's kind of greater separation between the words. So everything is sort of slow and drawn out and exaggerated. And this technique of infant-directed speech is actually very helpful for babies. It helps them to understand what you're saying, especially when they might be a little bit underdeveloped with that type of rapid auditory processing. So it doesn't mean like making up words or using like baby talk, like made up words or anything like that. You can use normal speech and normal grammar, just slowing it down for them and really exaggerating what you're talking about can really help. So then the second aspect of hearing and auditory processing that I wanted to highlight was the way that babies learn their native language sounds. So in language, in all the languages of the world, there's a different set of sounds that creates meaning. So each language has a special set of sounds in it that other languages might not necessarily use that contain meaning. So as an example of this, in Hindi, there's 2 different sounds that one refers to lentils and one refers to tree branches, but the sounds sound very similar. So the first one is dal, which is lentils. So I'm making that D sound by putting my tongue to the tip of to the back of my front teeth. So dal. I wish I could play the sounds for you, but I don't think they're going to work on this platform, unfortunately. So I'm going to try to say them correctly. So dal is for lentils, and then dal is for tree branch. So I'm putting my tongue to the roof of my mouth. So they're very similar sounds, and actually because I'm not a native Hindi speaker, it's very difficult for me to hear the difference between those sounds. But they are actually physically different. I'm moving my mouth in a different way to make those sounds. So, and as you can see, even though the sounds themselves are very similar, they have completely different meanings. So lentils versus tree branches, they're very different. And for somebody who's a native Hindi speaker, they probably, if I was saying them correctly, they probably have no problem telling the difference between them. So in contrast to that, because I'm a native English speaker, when I hear doll, I hear like baby doll. They sound the same. No matter if I put my tongue to the front of my mouth or to the roof of my mouth, it's always going to be interpreted as just baby doll. So for babies, before they're 6 months old, so when they're very little, they can distinguish sounds from any language. Babies are born able to learn any language, basically. So if you have an under 6 month old sitting here on your lap right now, they would be able to hear the difference between doll and doll, the 2 different Hindi sounds. They wouldn't know the meaning of the sounds yet because they're not distinguishing between tree branch and lentils necessarily, but they could physically hear the difference between those sounds. And then as babies get older, so between 6 and 12 months, babies get specialized for their native language. So they become very efficient processors of the sounds that are important to their own native language. And we can actually see this again using those EEG techniques that I talked about before in the way that their brains respond. Their brain becomes very efficient at responding to sounds from their native language. And this is one of the reasons that it gets harder to learn a new language when you're an adult, which if you've ever tried to do that, it can be very challenging. It's because, well, part of the reason is because our brains have a really hard time just hearing those differences in sounds that are important to that language. So this is our other tip, is that infancy is a really good time to expose babies to different languages, and they can really benefit from that exposure, whether it's a parent who's multilingual or even like a babysitter or a preschool environment that has that different language input. Even a little bit can really help to train their brains to be prepared for language learning later on. So now I'm talking about all these hearing milestones, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about language milestones so that you have kind of an idea of what to expect at different ages. And the way that we evaluate this in the lab is that we have these standardized assessments that have different tasks that we have babies do. Like we might show them a picture and ask them like and say like, where's the doggy or something like that, and see if they can recognize where it is. Or we ask parents about what they think that their child is understanding or what they're able to say. So these assessments have been given to babies all over the world, and we can look at how, one baby kind of individually is comparing to the language trajectories of lots of different babies around the world. So from birth to about 3 months, there's kind of different steps that happen that tend to happen in this order, but it's not exact. So it's approximately from birth to 3 months, babies start being able to recognize familiar voices. They will also cry to express their needs, of course, and they'll smile at familiar people. And then from about 3 to 6 months, they start to respond to the tone of your voice. So they will definitely know when you are angry at them or happy. They'll start paying attention to music. They might even like dance around a little bit. They start cooing and laughing, and producing those language-like noises. They're starting to get some babbling that sounds a little bit like speech. And they'll especially make these kind of like happy or upset noises like and like in different tones that let you know what they're thinking a little bit. And then from 7 to 12 months, babies start to, in terms of what they can receive or their receptive language, they can start understanding what it means when you point somewhere, that means that they should look there. They'll also recognize their own name a little bit, and they'll start to respond to common words. Like if you say a sibling or a pet's name, they might start looking around for where they are. And then they'll also attend to games like peekaboo, and they'll start to have enough attention to pay attention to some short stories. And then in terms of expressive language, so what they're able to say, they start babbling. That sounds a lot more like speech now. So it'll be like ba, ba, ga, ga, that kind of thing. And they'll start using gestures like wave bye-bye or blow kisses. And around the first birthday is when they'll start to say their first word. So they're going to use these sounds that might sound a little bit like babbling, like mama and dada, but they're using them in the correct context. So they might use them like specifically when their mom or their dad is around or when they're looking for them. So this is our tip, is that babies, you'll notice from all of this is that babies tend to understand language before they're able to speak. So they might understand their sibling's name before they can actually say the sibling's name. So keep talking to them and reading to them. All that input is very important to their development, even if it seems like they're not like quite responding to you yet. They're definitely listening. And then finally, the last thing that I want to highlight, because this is something that we are really interested in our lab, is language-based developmental disorders. So in these disorders, such as autism, language impairments, and ADHD, researchers have noticed that there's some, in older children and adults who have been diagnosed with these disorders, they tend to process sensory information a little bit differently than people who don't have these diagnoses. So for example, in autism, that might look like a hypersensitivity to sounds or to touch or to visual, to light, to input. In the case of language impairments, that might look like a harder time processing those rapidly changing sounds that we talked about before. So we can see these in people who have been diagnosed with that, but then researchers started to wonder, like, okay, if we try to trace this back, how far back does it go in development? When do these differences start to emerge? And so what we in other labs have seen is that when we study infants who have a family history of these disorders, So that means that they have a parent or a sibling who's been diagnosed with the disorder, and therefore they're at higher genetic risk for the disorder. These babies already show differences in the way that, especially they process sounds, because that's what we study. So they are already processing those really rapidly changing sounds a little bit differently than babies who don't have that family history. So one of the big questions that we have now is, can we provide babies with some early sensory experiences to support their hearing and language development? So you might have heard of early intervention for kids, for example, who have been diagnosed like early with a language impairment or autism. So this is like very, very early intervention. So we in the lab had developed kind of an auditory training program where we can give babies extra practice with processing sounds that are very fast in time. And we can see, and we're looking now to see if that helps to support their hearing later on. So the main points to remember out of all this are that babies are active learners, so they're little scientists. They're using their senses to pick up on all the clues in the environment around them. Their senses improve over time, so they get better at hearing, vision, all of that over the first year of life especially. Auditory processing supports language development, so the ability to hear is really important if you're trying to pick out what speech sounds mean. And there are just easy ways that you can support brain development every day. You guys are probably doing a lot of these things already. They're very intuitive, and you can kind of start to intentionally build these into your routines and help support your baby's learning. So we would not know any of this without the help of infant volunteers. That's really kind of the foundation of our research. So if you are interested in these topics and you think that you would like to support science, you can volunteer to be in some of our research studies and help us learn about development. So we have fun studies for babies aged 4 to 18 months. We're located on the Rutgers Newark campus. We're a part of Rutgers. And so families come in with their babies and we do these standardized assessments and the EEG measures that I mentioned before. And everything is very safe, non-invasive, very baby friendly. We love babies in our lab, so we love spending this time with them. And families are paid for their time in addition to receiving some information about their baby's development. So usually parents tell us that this is a really valuable experience for them, both in terms of like their baby enjoys it and they have fun being there, but then they also learn a little bit about development and the milestones that their babies are hitting as well. So if you're interested, please scan this code now with your phone to enter our raffle and to learn more. You can also come to our booth. I will be there this afternoon as well as other people in our lab. So we'll answer some questions now, but then if you have more questions that we didn't get to, feel free to come by and talk to us. We love talking to you guys. Or go to our website and learn a little bit more about development and how you can participate in research.